Mhm. All right. Hello, everyone. We have about five participants. Okay. We have 17 participants. More people are joining. Hi, guys. Thank you for joining us. We'll be starting in a few minutes as more people join in. And in the meantime, it would be great if you guys can just introduce yourselves, say hi in the chat. The platform here limits us to not be able to see you or talk to you guys. But Gerhard and I are really grateful to all of you for joining in from different parts of the world, different time zones. And who knows how many people are just staying up late in the night for this webinar. It's amazing. We have Austin, Donnie. Thanks for tuning in. We have Sandeep from Nagpur. Hello, Sandeep. We have Jan, who got up extra early today for the webinar from Germany. That's so nice. Ashwin sends its greeting from Hyderabad. Hi, Ashwin. Thank you. We have BTP Studios, prod by, I'm sorry, I couldn't read that right. Prod by Obanemi. Did I spell your name wrong? Also, this anybody streaming on YouTube. Um, Guys, can you please confirm if you can hear us? Okay, we have Sawyer from streaming on YouTube. A lot of people on YouTube actually. Cool, we are audible. Gerhard, can you just say something so we can make sure that you're audible on the chat as well?
Yeah. Hopefully you guys can hear me as well.
Awesome. We have 20 people already, and we'll wait for a few to join in. And within 5 and 10 minutes, we'll begin with the webinar. Hi Sawyer, Sawyer's from Canada, Ontario. We have Basu from Bangalore. Thank you for joining in. We have Arturo from Merida, Mexico. Hi Arturo. Okay, it's 10:05 already, and we have 20 participants on Riverside and 11 on YouTube. So I think it's time to begin. So everyone can hear us as well. So let me just start by introducing myself and Gerhard. I am Vipul, running a company called GrayVee Acoustics. And beyond all that we do, running free educational webinars is something that I really love and wish to keep doing more and more all over if I have the time for it. And I'm very thankful to Gerhard, who not only agreed for this webinar for no compensation at all for his time, but also he spent many hours designing and reiterating this webinar with me. And in fact, most, if not all of this webinar is actually planned entirely by Gerhard, keeping in mind that actually everyone benefits attending this webinar. I've mentioned this before and I'll say it again that this is not a typical how to build a studio guide or a studio session. Gerhard will rather be going through some of the mainstream approaches to set up, design, or build a studio on many different levels, and most importantly, cover the reasons behind making the decisions that we do for our clients. Reasons related to finances, property use, end use, terms of space, architectural limitations, and everything that barely anyone covers or talks about on the practical side of things, which are really subjective to everyone, regardless of how just the room sounds, the desired room response. And before I hand it over to Gerhard, although I'm sure all of you guys know what a genius this man is, from acoustics to mastering to designing his own custom speakers, let me tell you, the level of knowledge he has is nuts. And I'm not exaggerating at all. And to the skeptical ones, he also has an impressive portfolio and credits from working with amazing artists like Burna Boy, Thames, Becca Mastering, Jesse Ray Unster, Doja Cat, and UMI, earning multiple award nominations like Grammy and Juno. I'm 100% sure everybody attending this session, be it an enthusiast or a professional, you'll get good value to take back home if you stick through the end. Feel free to keep asking your questions in the chat on either of the platforms you're attending, Riverside or YouTube. We'll get your questions and answer them as we progress in the session. For those attending on Riverside via a laptop or a desktop, also get an option for live call in. There will be a button with live call in one of the corners for you, through which you guys can join the video chat and ask your questions in deeper context if needed. But we'll only take live call-ins during the Q&A session after the end of presentation. So the flow is maintained and there is no interruption through the session. Gerhard, please take it from here.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and have worked quite a bit on this presentation together. Let me start sharing. Are you able to see that okay? Sorry, it looks like
Yes, everybody can see Gerhard's screen, right?
Yep. Okay. Yeah, so we're going to be looking at studio design approaches and practical paths to building your studio. This is a bit of an unusual presentation when it relates to designing studios and studio acoustics and all those things that most of you here are probably familiar with and are probably also interested in learning about. We're not really going to be talking about kind of very specific details about acoustics and the actual acoustic design of a space. We're focusing on something else, which is more so the practical paths to building a studio. And so let's say you have your own room, you want to improve the acoustics of it, whether it's for recording or mixing, mastering, whatever it might be. You have an existing room, or maybe not even an existing room, something that you want to build out from the ground up. And there are many different ways you can approach that project, and there are many different factors involved, and lots of pros and cons that you might be considering. So we're going to be having a look at that, and hopefully you guys can walk away from this with a better sense of some different options that you might be able to take that perhaps you didn't know of before. This is not really any new information, but I feel like we've found a way to really summarize this and put it all together in a way that's hopefully meaningful and helpful. So we're going to be focusing on 3 different execution approaches for your studio acoustics. So what does that really mean? Let's say you have an acoustic idea design that you want to take on. Say you want to have some absorption here, some absorption there, maybe some diffusers, whatever it might be. At the end of the day, you need to take that kind of theoretical idea and put it into practice and build out a room that implements that design, whatever it may be. So there's different ways you can approach that, and that's what I'm calling the execution methods and execution approaches. Now, while we are kind of dividing these things into 3 different approaches, 3 different ways to look at things, there's really no clear defining lines, and it's not like a project has to fall into one category or another. It's really more so just for the sake of being able to look at these different categories and why you might want to lean more towards one versus the other. It's not so much that you really have to pick one and your studio has to be designed just that way. Now, when you're designing a studio, maybe you have some acoustics knowledge of your own and you want to just tackle that project on your own, or maybe you're hiring someone like me or like Vipul to help you out with that design. Now, our roles can change quite a bit in a project depending on what's involved in the project. The different factors that we're looking at, the kind of design that we might be providing back to you, the level of detail that might be in there. And these 3 different execution approaches tend to have very differing amounts of work and kind of deliverables that we might be providing for you. Now, some of the different factors that we're going to be looking at for these different approaches and comparing would be budget. Most of us tend to have a limited budget, a certain number in mind that we have to stay below. Of course, some projects maybe don't really have a budget limit, but most of the time we do have to work within a certain budget. Then we have our sonic expectations, or really what you want this room to turn out like. Perhaps your expectations aren't all that high and you just want to get a space into kind of a basics that you can work in, or you want something that's world class. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean you can always achieve that. Sometimes you might have certain limitations that you're working within, and that might have somewhat of a ceiling, and you need to keep your expectations realistic. Then there's the source of treatment. So kind of where that's coming from. How is that getting to your room? Whether who you're buying it from, where it's being built, things like that. And then also the complexity of execution. So could you have your studio go from an empty room to a finished studio in a day? In some approaches that's possible. In other situations, you might spend years building out this space. So there's quite a different levels of complexity that you might be looking at when approaching a studio build. Then there's the permanence aspect of it. So sometimes you might have something that you could easily take with you to a new room. Sometimes not so much, and your space is kind of going to be a studio quite permanently, unless you're really renovating that space into something else down the road. Now, there's also the ability to modify the space that you need to consider. Sometimes you might be renting a space and you can't do so much, or perhaps it's just a space in your house. And again, you're not really looking to change too much, or you might be working from sort of a ground up build where the sky's the limit and you're either building an entirely new building for your studio, or you have a giant space that you're building essentially a detached structure inside of. So that can vary quite a bit. Of course, there's kind of structural and space limitations. We usually want a room that's a little bigger than what we might realistically have, and we can't always have the space that we really want. And along with that, there's sometimes some structural limitations where you may be wanting to do something and it's just not really possible to do that in the space that you're working within. And then lastly, there's different aesthetic considerations. Perhaps you might want to spend a little more and get some better kind of aesthetics. Sometimes you may want to just focus on the acoustics and kind of get the most acoustical benefit that you can get out of a design without necessarily spending that much on the acoustics and focusing so much on the aesthetics of things. So throughout this presentation, we're going to be looking at this room here. The idea of this room isn't really to provide any kind of specific acoustic device, or sorry, specific acoustic advice. It's just kind of a generic room, and we're going to be putting in we're going to be building out the studio in different ways. And it's really the idea to look at how these different approaches might play out and what the space might end up looking like. It's really not so much about what exactly we're doing in this space. It's more so just how we're approaching the project itself. So right here we have essentially just the empty room with nothing in it, but your speakers and your little desk setup. So the first approach that I want to have a look at is what I call the panel order. So this would be simply calling someone up, going to a company like GIK, and placing an order from them. I'm sure most of you are familiar with acoustic panels and what they look like. Typically, at least in North America, it's sort of a 2 foot by 4 foot. That's a pretty standard size that you might have, something around 0.5 meter by 1 meter or so, fairly small units. And this is a very straightforward approach to take. There's not much that has to really go into it. You can simply call them up, and hopefully within not too long, you can have these panels delivered to you. As far as ease of execution goes, it doesn't really get much simpler than that. You may hire someone to install these panels for you. You may put them up yourself. But again, it's generally quite easy to take a space that's empty and go with a panel order and have something that's like a studio. Now, one of the advantages to this is it tends to be minimally invasive in terms of how you're changing the room, what kind of damage you're doing to the room. You can potentially even have a panel-based approach where you do no damage at all to the room, where the panels could be on stands, they could be on kind of their own little structure that holds them up, and they could essentially do no damage whatsoever to the existing room if it's a rental. With a panel order approach, you can also take those panels with you to a new room in most cases, and set up a new space that you move into and turn that into hopefully a usable space like what you had before. It's not really a permanent solution into the space that you're in generally. Now, just because it's a somewhat simple approach doesn't necessarily mean that the results have to be very limited. You can go from just a handful of panels up to filling up most of your room with panels. So as far as the results you can get, they can vary quite a bit, from the bare minimum to a great mixing space. Now, as far as the aesthetics go, it's generally a little limited, largely because with a panel order, you're typically getting these panels shipped to you. So there are certain size limitations. I'm sure you're familiar with rooms that have panels in them and what that looks like. It has somewhat of a modular look to it. It's not really going to be entire walls covered. And even if they are entire walls covered, you're going to see that it's somewhat independent panels placed together. So from an aesthetic point of view, you are somewhat limited in what you can do. Now, of course, some companies offer much nicer looking panels than others. You could choose to perhaps spend a little more and get, say, panels that have a nice wood side on them versus just a simple fabric wrapped panel. So there is some freedom with aesthetics, and sometimes you can choose to spend a little more and get a little better aesthetics. But at the end of the day, it is generally going to look like fairly small panels. And there's not too much you can do to get around that, especially if they're panels that you're ordering from someone that's going to be shipping them to you. It's just pretty tough to ship giant panels. Now, as far as hiring someone to help you out with a design, that person, whether it's me, whether it's someone else you might be working with, there's different things that they might be helping you out and kind of different deliverables for the project. In the simplest form, getting a panel approach put together could be just a call. You could call me up. I could give you some basic pointers. Put some panels here, put some panels there. Maybe order these panels from this company, and you call them. You order those panels, and you call it a day. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Now, of course, you may be wanting to get some kind of more detailed sketch, more something resembling a floor plan showing where to put the panels. Now going with this panel order, of course, a big part of it is essentially going to be just a shopping list of here's what you're going to order from GIK or Prim Acoustic or any other company that it might be. So that's kind of a large part of it, is just giving you an itemized list of what you should order. Now, you may or may not have things like acoustic measurements and simulations factored into this. Most of the time, panel order-based projects are a little on the simpler side, so you may not necessarily be looking at acoustic measurements or simulations. It might just be a matter of getting the basics covered. And then lastly, you may or may not be looking at getting 3D renderings. That can get expensive, compared to just having a call to get some basic pointers. That's quite a bit more work for the person you're working with to deliver that for you. So having a look here, kind of a typical simple panel-based approach to this room. A couple of thin panels around the room. This is something you typically find, especially for kind of simpler project studios. Now, of course, this isn't what a panel order-based approach has to be limited to. You can do quite a bit more. It doesn't have to be really just kind of this bare basics minimum approach. So we could add a couple more panels. Here we've gotten some thicker panels all around the room. Kind of the GIK soffit style panels up in those front corners, kind of stacked up. Looking quite tall. You still have some of that kind of modular look to it. But some decent coverage in the room. You'll most likely get better results than the previous image we just looked at. And then we could also take it a step up from there, where we're covering even more. You got lots of thick GIK panels, like their soffits. Maybe some membrane absorbers there. That can be shown like as the green color there. And we're starting to approach covering most of the room with these panels. So you can potentially get some very nice results. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to get very limited results when you're just ordering panels. Having said that, if we're going to be looking at budget, it can vary quite a bit. If you're just ordering a couple of panels, it can be quite affordable, especially from some of the companies out there. They offer very affordable kind of small panels. Now, if you're looking at ordering, dozens of panels, something like this, it can add up quickly to be ordering so many panels. And of course, there's also the shipping that can be quite a bit. If you can imagine having to ship all these panels to you, whether it's across the country or from an entirely different country. So it can add up quickly, and it's not necessarily the cheapest option. But when you're just getting started, it can be a great option if you're just ordering a couple of panels. Now, the next approach, the execution approach to look at, is quite similar, but now we're looking at custom panels. So rather than just going on to a website, like say from Prim Acoustic and ordering what they have on there, now we're looking at some custom designs. Now, this could be DIY, so you're building the panels yourself. You could have a contractor who is building them on site for you, or that could also be just a friend that you're working with. That's kind of DIY, built on site, or it could also be a custom panel order. So there are many different manufacturers that are willing to build any kind of custom design. For example, I work a lot with Music City Acoustics based in Nashville, and most of the time they're willing to build any design that I give to someone that they take to them and want to order those panels from them. And they're able to build my custom designs, no problem. Either ship them or deliver them locally. So it can also come from a company that typically sells other kind of non-custom options. Now, why would you want to have a custom panel order when you can just simply go and order what they have available? One of the big things is to have more flexibility in the design and have things that don't really exist on the market. Um, so, for example, in a lot of the rooms that I design, I use membrane absorbers, and they're just simply something you can't order from anyone. No one's selling those designs that I'm creating. Um, so you really need a custom order for that. That can potentially lead to better results. That's kind of why I would choose to create those designs instead of just saying order this. So you can potentially get some better results compared to just ordering your off the shelf, not custom panels. So that's one of the big factors and one of the big reasons why you'd want to have custom panels. Now, along those similar lines, you can also get improved aesthetics, and that comes from whether you're building building it yourself, or having it built on site by someone else, or potentially ordering from someone locally. If you're not having those panels shipped, then you have much greater flexibility in the dimensions that you're building. So, for example, the picture here on the right there with those sort of white panels, they're quite big panels, and they look almost floor to ceiling. Um, so, people tend to prefer having something that looks like that rather than smaller panels potentially kind of stacked up on each other. And you can do this when it's custom panels because you're not worried about having to ship them. And so they can be much larger and you can get a much cleaner look to things. Now, on the budget side of things, this can vary quite a bit. If you're building a design DIY, then that tends to be the most affordable option. You can a lot of times you can build them cheaper than you'd be able to order them from anyone else. Of course, you're just basically paying for the materials. Now, if you're having them built on site for you with a contractor, or whether you're placing a custom order from someone else, then of course the prices can vary quite a bit. Some people I work with offer really great pricing, some contractors, some panel companies, and it can be a very affordable option. Or sometimes people might charge a premium for those custom designs, and so you're going to pay quite a bit, and it might be a lot more than a simple off-the-shelf kind of standard panel order.
Also, I'd like to expand a bit on this, the way
Yep.
Gerhard explained the design flexibility part. Like it's so much easier when you go with custom treatments. When you instead of going with off the shelf stuff, like I've seen Gerhard's work. Gerhard also offers, if I'm not mistaken, Gerhard, you do offer diaphragmatic traps in your custom panels as well, right?
Yep.
Gerhard is just too humble to just say it out, put it out that what he sells, but having diaphragmatic traps designed as a standalone unit is a pretty tricky thing to do. Even in the full blown build out projects, it's very difficult to design membranes and have them tuned to the room response, the modal concentration areas, and everything that goes along with it. But that's the benefit of having custom panels too. You know, about the build cost, it can vary region to region when you're designing it, who's the designer and who's the constructing team. Are you doing it DIY, or are you hiring specialist contractor for that? So it can vary region to region, people to people, the budget side of things, but the acoustic benefit is greater in custom panels all the time.
Yeah, and I mean, you of course you could design something that's simpler, and just because you're doing your own custom panels doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a world class studio. Of course, you could draw the line somewhere and make something simpler, but in general, yeah, like Vipul said, you do have quite a bit more flexibility, and you can do things that aren't really otherwise possible. That you simply can't order panels that do the same thing. So looking at, if you're working with someone like me or someone else to give you a design, to help you design your space and turn it into a studio. So some of the things that they might be looking at and some of the sort of services they might be providing for you. At the simplest level, it might just be something like a sketch, floor plan saying, put this panel here and this panel here. Now, of course, we're looking at custom panels, so you need to know what to build. So at this, compared to the kind of off the shelf panel order, with a custom panel order, it's a little more work for the acoustic designer because they also need to provide you with the instructions for building the panels, for the designs, something that someone can execute, whether it's you building it yourself, whether you're passing these plans along to a different company that's going to deliver them to you. You need to have those instructions to know what to do. Now, again, you may or may not have things like acoustic measurements and simulations factored in. Typically, if it's kind of more of a simple project of just putting a couple panels in the room, you might not really have much in terms of measurements and simulations. Or you're doing something much more complex where you're basically covering the entire room and you're going for the best results possible. And then you're likely going to be looking at things like acoustic measurements and simulations. Now, of course, here you might also, again, be getting things like 3D renderings. It's not necessarily a given. Some people might provide that. Some people might provide a simpler sketch with some instructions. In the past, I used to provide very simple instructions, just focusing on put this panel here, put this panel there, and here are the designs for the panels. But nowadays, I've kind of just moved on into creating things in just a 3D model where I can just kind of bring in these different panels and put them into the space. And it's a lot more, it's a lot easier to look at the design and get a sense of what the space will look like, even if they're not very fancy 3D renderings. And some people do offer very kind of photorealistic 3D renderings. That tends to take quite a bit of time to produce. So it can change the budget and how much that design is going to cost you. Now, with a custom panel based design, you may be coordinating with the builder as well. If someone's DIYing their design, they're probably going to be asking me questions about, am I doing this right? What am I supposed to do for this? Maybe I've run into this issue. So then there tends to be some more back and forth compared to just placing an order and calling it a day. If they're working with someone else who's going to execute that design for them, then I might be coordinating with that person directly, with that contractor, whoever it might be, or the company that's going to be delivering these custom panels. So there tends to be more communication required between the team involved, just to get these custom panels built and really make sure that everything is getting done how you'd like to get it done as a designer. And so, ultimately the person will get the best result and what you try to design for them. Do we want to? Sorry, I guess let's look at some examples first. So here would be, our same room with some big panels. We're now building our own panels, ordering them customly made, so we can get big sizes. That tends to look a little better than having a lot of small panels. But this would be an example of a fairly simple approach. It could even be essentially non-invasive to the room. If you could have your panels on stands, you could have a little support structure to hold some clouds, and there could really be no damage at all done to that room. If it's a rental and you're going to have to be moving to a different space, this is something you could also easily take with you to a different space and kind of set up in a similar fashion. And then we could look at something a little more involved, where now we have most of the room covered, more panels along the walls. Maybe we have some membrane absorbers kind of shown there in green. Again, this isn't meant to be any kind of specific acoustic advice. This is just really a general idea of what a custom panel-based design might look like. And then you can see there at the back, we might have some layered panels if you have the space and that's something that you're looking to do. So at this point, we're really getting most of the room covered with these large custom panels. Before we get into the next category, do we have any questions?
We have a couple of questions, although they are not related to the current presentation. Do you want to take them up right now, or would you like to take them up in the end of the session?
I guess if they're not related to what we just covered, we can maybe hold off until the end.
Yeah, sure. It's mostly related to how listening room should sound and room measurements. Let's take this up in the end.
Okay. So the third and last category to look at is what's called frame treatment, or at least that's what I tend to call it. Some may call it something else. So with frame treatment, it's...
if you don't mind, I'd
Yep.
like to interrupt you in between. There's a question related to the presentation. So
Yep.
Marco asks, I see the corners panels not being directly at the corner and a bit more towards the side walls. Is there any reason for that?
So I guess at this picture here.
Yep.
So I mean, again, I'm not really trying to give any kind of acoustic advice here. Those panels could really be placed anywhere in the room. The goal is here really just to get a sense of what a panel based design with some custom features might look like when you're getting more coverage in the room. Maybe perhaps at the end that's something we could discuss, but kind of for the sake of the discussion, we're really just looking at the sort of sizes of panels, kind of the number of panels, what your room might end up looking like if you were to go with a plan like this. If you hired me to design it, if you hired someone else to design it for you, they could look completely different. Someone could use completely different thicknesses of panels, different kinds of panels. They could use diffusers, they could use porous absorber panels, they could use other different kinds of panels and kind of place them anywhere that they see fit based on the kind of design philosophy that they're after. So I don't really want to be giving out acoustic advice here and saying this is why we put that panel there. Of course, the way that I've laid out these kind of example sketches is somewhat along the lines of how I would approach a room like this. And of course, that's just kind of how I built out these 3D models. But really, it could look completely different. So yeah, maybe we can touch back on that at the end. But I think for now,
Yeah,
we could maybe just
absolutely.
move
I think
on.
it also just depends on the designer to designer, but the main approach with corners, because I get where the question arises. There's all sorts of myths on the internet about having the corners being completely filled for ideal modal response, and they call it the base traps when they're selling it on off-the-shelf units, which doesn't make sense at all. So the thing, Marco, here is, you the corners are important, sure. There's no denying about it, but they're not as important as people make it look like. So you don't need to have a full 45-degree corner cover all the time. It depends what kind of stuff you're putting in. How's the speaker orientation? The reason the 45-degree angles or 30-degree angles come is the way speakers are oriented and flush along the wall, and which is a separate discussion in itself, which I am not sure if we'll be going in the at least not in the middle of the presentation. But if we have the time and if we stick around till the end, we'll cover this in more detail. But yeah, it's pretty much subjective, and there's nothing in particular about the angle of a porous absorber. Especially when there's nothing hard behind the absorber, there's no real benefit in adding a particular angle when the absorber is pretty much soft. Also, we have one last question in this. Ashwin asks, is there a benefit? Wait a second, I'll highlight it. Is there a benefit of adding square soffit corners versus straddle corners versus triangular corner traps? Like in the last photo, there is an option for a membrane trap in the straddle corner design.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, so this is if we want to just touch a second on how I would potentially do a room like this, kind of shown in green would be how I might place the membrane absorbers, just kind of directly parallel to the wall there. The membrane absorbers typically aren't angled across the corner because in most cases you want them to be as close as possible to the room boundary. So kind of putting it across the corner would go against that and kind of getting it away from the room boundaries. And then there are other panels in front of that, which of course need to not run into those membrane absorbers. So they're kind of placed in an orientation that allows them to be there without taking up too much space and while still leaving space for that membrane absorber behind. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. We should move forward to this. Ashwin, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to ask. We'll take it up.
So moving on to frame treatment, we get into something that's quite a bit different from a panel-based design, and there can often be a lot of confusion as to what really goes into these designs. I've seen a lot of people call them a room within a room, and personally, I would never call a frame treatment design that. I reserve that more so for looking at isolation. And I think calling it a room within a room is just somewhat misleading and tends to confuse people. Um, but you might not often run into these in certain parts of the world where you have lots of studios built out. It's very common. In other places, if you're maybe in less of a place where there are a lot of studios built, you might never really come across a studio that uses frame treatment. So the idea here with frame treatment is you have some framed walls. Kind of that image there. It's not too easy to tell what's going on in that image, but the idea there is we have a framed wall that you can see in the wood, and you can see kind of some studs there. And then in front of that, kind of to the right of that, you can see that thin blue line. There's kind of a little space with some little things on the ends there at the top and the bottom. So the idea is you use what's called a fabric track system. So these fabric tracks are these kind of plastic devices that get attached onto the framing, and then the fabric gets tucked into those fabric tracks, so you can get very clean lines. There are other ways that you could attach the fabric, so we're not necessarily this category isn't just reserved for if a design is using fabric tracks. You could still use frame treatments and simply staple on the fabric and then cover it with trim. There are countless different options. The idea really is that we're framing walls. So you can see kind of on the right there, studio build in progress, where they have, kind of wooden walls framed out that are holding insulation materials. And then ultimately that usually gets covered in fabric. So we're generally looking at covering larger surfaces, kind of entire walls. It's not like a smaller panel where it might be a 2 foot by 4 foot area, maybe 1 meter by 1 meter. We're typically looking at much larger areas and covering potentially the entire room could be covered with frame treatment. Now, this could be done DIY, of course. There's nothing really stopping you from framing walls and putting insulation materials in them and attaching fabric tracks, or using attaching fabric in another way. But this tends to be a little more daunting for the average DIYer. So typically, when you're looking at frame treatments, you're going to be working with contractors. Now, due to the nature of frame treatment and how it's really built into your space, this isn't really something you can typically order off sites and have just delivered to you. Maybe there's some options where you can order all the wood to be cut and things like that and delivered and then kind of assembled in the space. But really, at the end of the day, this is more involved construction that's being done in the space. And it's not something you can simply order and have show up your door. It really needs to be built on site for you. Now, along those same lines, it is a very permanent solution. So this isn't really something you're going to be able to take with you realistically to a new space. Of course, you could take it down and reuse some materials and things along those lines, but it's not like a panel-based approach where you can just take the panel off the wall and carry it off into a different room and hang it up. This is really kind of along the lines of building walls in your house. It's not really something you can just easily move around. Now, kind of relating to that is also the issue of permitting. Based on where you live and the project that you're doing, you may or may not need to go through things like building permits. With panel-based treatments, that's typically just considered furniture. Like kind of putting up a bookcase. You really don't need a building permit for that. But with frame treatment, you're putting up kind of walls in your space. You could be making kind of structural modification, things like that. So, a lot of the times you do need to be going through the permitting process. Now, this could be an existing room, in your house, in a commercial building that you're turning into a studio, or it could be an entirely new room that you're building out. Now, of course, with the previous two cases that we were looking at, the two approaches with the panels, that could also be an entirely new room. That's not exclusive to frame treatment. But generally, when we're looking at frame treatment, that's when the projects tend to also involve things like a ground up build. Of course, some people may want to build an entirely new building and then just put in some panels. There's nothing wrong with that. But typically, when someone is going through the hassle of all that major construction and putting up a building, they may be wanting to go with something like frame treatment. As I mentioned before, most of the room is often covered. It's not just a couple of panels here and there, a couple of frame sections here and there. It's really usually looking at entire walls that are going to be covered in this framing. Now, along the same lines of kind of building a new room and having some freedom to really kind of do whatever you want and building up new walls and things like that, you may have the possibility to be looking at flush-mounted speakers and things like speaker decoupling, kind of having your speakers built into the wall with kind of a simple panel-based project in a rental space. That's really not a possibility. Now, again, that's not to say that you're never going to be working with a panel-based project and not be able to have flush mount speakers. That could definitely be a situation. You could build a ground-up room and have flush mounted speakers and all that, and put up panels in the space. There's nothing wrong with that. But typically with frame treatment, we're kind of looking at projects that want to go a little beyond what you can do with panels. Now, as far as what the acoustic designer is going to be providing, kind of what they're going to be looking at, what they're going to be helping you out with, with these designs, it tends to be a lot more involved. So typically you need something that resembles more of a construction set of, blueprints, things like that. It's not just simpler instructions for building plans, especially if you're going through permitting. Someone needs to put together drawings that inspectors and your local authority is going to be looking at. So you do need something that's a lot more detailed as far as your plans go. Now, typically with this, you're also looking at acoustic simulation. Now, of course, that's not always the case. You could definitely make a simpler acoustic design and not be factoring that in, not have any kind of acoustic simulations or measurements. But a lot of the times, these are kind of higher budget projects that want higher sonic expectations. And so acoustic simulations will generally be factored into that. Now, there's also looking at isolation, kind of the shell design, kind of the shape of the room. Those are also aspects that are often looked at when we're looking at frame treatment. And that's something we'll touch on a little more at the end. Now, 3D renderings are also very common here because we're looking at full sets of plans and things like that. It usually goes hand in hand with having even just some basic 3D renderings to get a sense of what the space will look like. Now, also at this kind of level of project, you're typically collaborating with other professionals, even just in the design stage of things. So there might be an architect or draftsman putting together the official plans to be sent to the building inspectors and contractors. Typically when I'm working on projects like this, what I'm providing really only looks at the acoustic design or potentially the isolation design. I'm not providing a design that a building authority could really look at and give permits based on. I'm really just focusing on the acoustic aspects of things, but that's not always the case. Someone who you're working with might be providing that entire set of plans, and you may not be working with an architect or draftsman. Now, there may also be an interior designer that you're working with, maybe having some back and forth with on different aesthetic designs in the space, things like fabric choices and lighting and furniture, things like that. Of course, these are all things that could be looked at in the other execution approaches. If you're doing a panel-based build, you could definitely still be working with an interior designer who is guiding and helping you work with the client. But in these levels of projects with frame treatment, you're more likely to encounter this. You might have more direct contact with the general contractor who's building this design. You might be looking at working with a structural engineer, especially if you're doing kind of isolation work. There's also HVAC considerations, which generally play a pretty big role in these kind of larger build-outs, and also electrical work. So it tends to be a much bigger team that you're often working with on these projects. Just in general, they tend to be bigger projects. That's definitely not always the case. That just kind of is the general trend. But of course, you could have very simple framed-in treatment designs where you just provide the design, it gets built. There's no permitting, there's no interior design, nothing else. It could be a very straightforward process, but it tends to be a little more involved. And your acoustic designer or whoever you might be working with and helping you out will generally have much more involvement and be providing a lot more for that project. And understandably, will generally charge more to provide those services for you, compared to a simple panel-based approach where they might just be saying, put this here, put this there. They're quite different projects.
Gerhard, talking about the large scale projects, depending on project to project, how complex it is. Um, when you were talking about the collaborators, are there some specific key elements, key people, key specialists that you'd like to highlight that a person as owner of the studio who has hired a designer to design the acoustics should not skip on? That are there any particular people like such as the HVAC contractors, the general contractor, or some anything that you think that should not be skipped at all and should not be DIYed by anyone at all?
Yeah, I mean, really, none of these things here should be skipped on. Even if you're just putting some panels in your room, it's things like HVAC and electrical are definitely important. Um, so I would always recommend doing as much as you can and having the input of as many of these professionals as you can. Maybe if you're just putting up panels in a room, you don't really need a structural engineer. But it's generally a good idea to get input from all of the different professionals. And as you do bigger projects, then it's really just it's a necessity, to have an HVAC contractor and dealing with all that. If you don't have those professionals involved, you're kind of setting yourself up for disaster, and you could run into really big problems. Especially the structural engineer, you kind of need that. You can't really get around that when you're putting up big massive walls and isolation structures and things like that. So really, I think they're all pretty important. Sometimes you can kind of sacrifice certain things. Maybe you're not working with an interior designer. Maybe you don't really care about how your room ultimately looks, and it's really just about kind of getting the acoustic results. And that might be where your priorities are. If you're doing DIY, you could definitely do a kind of a frame treatment design DIY. I work with a lot of people who have just done the entire process themselves. Even I built out the room that I'm in right now, entirely on my own. And so, you're probably not going to be involved with as many contractors if you're doing everything yourself, but it's still just as important to get, your HVAC right. If you don't know what you're doing, then, definitely work with a professional. That's not to say you can't do it on your own. If you're basically qualified to handle these aspects on your own, then I would say go for it. But most people are generally not going to be. So then I would strongly advise that they do, get anyone involved that really needs to be involved and get
Yeah.
those things
You know,
designed, especially.
the
Yeah.
question actually stemmed from my own personal experiences. And DIY build is all good. I think when you can build a room and you have the time for it, go ahead. You should go for it. But the problem actually stems when you meet it halfway. A semi DIY project,
Mhm.
that's kind of a common thing in a lot of my projects. When a lot of my clients take up the project as a DIY, when they don't have a prior construction experience, but they take up the project by hiring subcontractors under their own payroll instead of hiring a general contractor for the entire project, which I think, not I think I've seen it has to always be turning out into a turmoil. The project that has to be of a few months long extends to a few years easily. And they always end up regretting it that we should have hired a general contractor. And the thing used to be about designers back in the day. Earlier, we used to see situations where people would DIY an acoustic design and then fall into trouble. But now, with the advent of social media and availability of information online, that's very surprisingly getting better. People are looking into better designs, they are hiring better designers. But the thing with general contractors is still on the edge, I think. You know, everybody who's building a studio, especially if you're going on an expensive project, please don't cut out the cost of hiring a general contractor. And also project management service as well. A designer, a general contractor, and a project management company who mediates between the two can help you a lot in the long run in both saving money, saving time, and saving efforts. So yeah, don't skip on that at all.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just to add a little to that, I think if you're tackling on a bigger project like this, it's definitely a good idea to work with either an individual or a company that has experience building studios and really knows everything that needs to go into it. As a designer, I try to provide as much information as I can and say, hey, look, you got to look at the HVAC. If maybe they've never thought about that during their project. I do try to just kind of steer them in the right direction of saying, we got to look at these things. But at the end of the day, it's always a good idea to have someone that has that experience and really knows that you're not missing out on something. HVAC tends to be, I think, the one that people often don't think about the most, or do and say, this doesn't matter for me. But even things like electrical, all these different design considerations are important. And unless you have the experience doing it or are working with someone who really can provide that knowledge and guide you through the process, you're just not really setting yourself up for success. And a lot can go wrong, especially on a bigger project. So looking at some examples of kind of the frame treatment approach, I just wanted to touch on that with these frame treatment designs, it's very tough, or it can be very tough to really see what's going on. So there can be more than meets the eye. Kind of this example that we're looking at here has, I don't remember if it was 1 or 2 inches of that treatment shown in gray all around the room. Now that's very typical. That there are many studios around the world designed just like this, where it's a couple of inches and then a fabric track system put over that, and the space looks like a studio. Your high frequency reflections are gone. But I think most or a lot of studio designers would say it's maybe not so much a good idea to do this, and would argue against doing this. But at the end of the day, this room looks entirely covered in fabric. You can't really tell what's going on behind it, and it just kind of looks like a studio. So if we, this next example here looks almost exactly the same. If you were to walk into this room, you might not really see much different. I guess the clouds that I put in here are a little thicker. Here we have these very thin clouds. Here we have a little slightly thicker clouds, but really the rest of the walls, from this perspective, this kind of cross-sectional view, we can see that there's more treatment there. But if you were to just walk into that room, you're most likely not really going to see any difference. The walls are still just going to look like fabric. So just because you're going with a frame treatment approach doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to have a certain level of results, and it could still vary quite wildly. Going back to kind of something like this, well, personally, I'm sure I could design a simple panel-based approach that would perform better than this. That's not to say maybe you do want to build this out. Maybe this is the approach that you want. And maybe this will give the results that you're after. And certainly the aesthetics of something like this can be a lot better than a panel-based approach. If you do want those kind of cleaner looking walls, just everything covered in fabric, that maybe this is a good idea for you. But we can make entirely different designs with frame treatment that really don't look all that different, because it is so hidden. Everything, kind of the acoustic design and the acoustic features in the room are all mostly hidden. Of course, you might have things like diffusers showing kind of in that wall that aren't covered in fabric, but most of the walls tend to be covered in that fabric track. And just another example where we've added even more. Here, kind of that back wall there is significantly more. We might even have many layers inside that. And again, at the end of the day, sure, you could probably tell this room has thicker treatment in it if you were to walk in and kind of see the sides of those walls. But in general, it's really going to look quite similar to the other examples we just saw. So just because you have a frame treatment approach doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have better or worse results than something else. Now, having said that, it tends to be the case that if you do want the ultimate results, you're generally going to be looking at frame treatment, largely because of the surface area. It's kind of just tough to get so much coverage in a room with panels. You'd be looking at dozens of panels all tightly butted up against each other to get a similar coverage. And in certain cases, at least with my designs, there are certain things that aren't really possible to do with panels. You kind of need these more complex assemblies with different layers in them, and it would be very difficult to try to kind of put that together using smaller panels placed together. Not say it's impossible, but generally these frame treatments can offer more possibilities and better results. And here's just another example of what an even more involved project might look like. Now we have a different room shape, something a lot more complex. This would be an example of a kind of a ground up build where we're controlling the geometry of the room. So just kind of taking it a step even further from before, where we just had a rectangular room. We can factor in other things like the isolation and the room geometry and even thicker treatment, and really try to go for the best possible results with this. And that's really not generally possible with the other approaches. And here's an example from GrayVee Acoustics of a room that might be along these lines, of just kind of having these more complex features and not really things you could easily get with a panel-based approach. Now, just looking at this picture, we see a lot of different angled structures and whatnot. But at the end of the day, it is quite difficult to see what's going on. So kind of going back to that more than meets the eye, this, on one hand, this could be a very simple acoustic design, or it could be something very complex. It's kind of hard to tell with a frame treatment design, and it really comes down to what you're after, who you're working with, what they're going to provide, as well as kind of budget considerations, what you're able to spend, if you're able to do more or less. So a frame design can vary quite a bit. So just to kind of summarize and compare these different approaches we've looked at. So as far as cost goes, with a panel order, it tends to be kind of a fairly low cost, where you're just going to call a company up like GIK and order some panels. Now there is the freight, the shipping, that can get quite a bit, especially if you're shipping at long distances. If the company isn't local and isn't just delivering them to you themselves, that can get quite expensive. And then there's also installation, whether you're putting up these panels yourself, whether you're hiring a professional to come in and put them up for you, that's just another aspect to consider when it comes to cost. With custom panels, if you're DIYing it, that tends to be very affordable, can be even cheaper than a panel order. But of course, it can vary quite a bit. So if you're going for kind of premium aesthetics, nice wood wrapped panels, things like that, you could pay quite a bit. And that going purely for the aesthetics, that's probably not going to have very many acoustic implications. The panel itself will still perform the same way, but you're choosing to spend a little more for those aesthetics. Now with a frame design, it tends to be a higher cost. Most of the time you're not doing that yourself, so you're working with contractors who are going to be coming in and building those walls in your space. And a lot of the times we're also looking at isolation. Now, having said that, there is sometimes kind of a tipping point between framed treatment and something like custom panels, where framed can potentially be more affordable, either whether you're doing it DIY or whether you're hiring a professional. A lot of the times just kind of framing out walls in your space is more affordable than building dozens of individual panels. And if you're doing that yourself, both the materials can be cheaper and it can be a lot faster for you to just frame a wall than build 20 panels to cover that same area. So framed treatment approach isn't necessarily more expensive, but that's just kind of the general trend. As far as aesthetic goes, with a panel order, you are quite limited in what can be shipped to you and what's available on the market. So if that's not something you're after, if you want something that looks different, that's not really the best option for you. With custom panels, things can vary quite a bit, and it can really look like anything. Simple fabric wrap panels, other panels with wood trim, things like that, can vary quite a bit. Now, the results visually can be somewhat similar to a frame treatment approach. If you have a lot of large panels in your room and they're kind of butted up next to each other, it'll look quite similar to having that wall just entirely covered in fabric and something like a fabric track system. At the same time, you tend to not get quite as clean lines. You will still be able to kind of tell that it is individual panels beside each other. So it can look similar, but generally just not quite as nice as a frame treatment could look if that's kind of the look that you're going for. With frame treatment, you do have a lot more freedom and can basically do whatever you want. Like if you wanted it to look like panels, I'm sure you could do kind of smaller structures that still look like panels. If you want to cover the entire walls, you can do that. You can really do whatever you want there, and different trim and things like that around the room that's on the treatments, and you can build the treatment around kind of features in the room. You can have custom furniture that's built into the treatment. You could have a bookcase that's built into the treatment. One studio that I designed has a little bar that's kind of built into the treatment wall in the back. So you do have a lot of freedom to really dial things in and get it looking exactly how you want it to.
Talking about aesthetics, a while ago, Ashwin has asked, what is your take on fabric versus PET felt exteriors?
Um, it Sometimes you do need fabric. Just kind of has it can different materials can have different acoustic implications. But in general, at least with how I usually design studios, there can be a lot of flexibility with that. Sometimes people are worried about installation materials coming through the fabric, and if they're using a fabric that's a little more open and with materials like fiberglass, we can add different other kind of fabric layers like non-woven fabrics to kind of help contain things. So there is generally a lot of flexibility, um, and kind of just different materials that are possible. So I wouldn't
Yeah,
say one is better than the other or anything like that.
Yeah, it can depend person to person, designer to designer, and that is the reason I actually just took it up in the aesthetics section because in my general designs we use both. We use a type of PET wadding before putting on the fabric that acts as a padding layer, and then we put on the fabric as well. So it's kind of like a personal choice in the end. It doesn't make a difference on the acoustics or function as much unless your design is specified to make a difference in that way.
Yeah, and especially with things like frame treatment, you can really do anything. You can kind of cover different aspects of the wall with different materials, different wood trim, things like that. With fabric wrapped panels, you're a little more limited in your options. But there is still some flexibility as far as the aesthetics go, and really kind of getting something that getting the look that you're after. I've done some situations where people wanted to use kind of more of a felt type, kind of a natural wool felt type material. That can definitely be an option as well.
Yeah, 100%.
So kind of looking at permanence and the reusability in a new space. So a panel-based, an off-the-shelf panel order, as far as permanence goes, that's very low. That's really not something that typically does a lot of damage to your room. You can usually really just take it with you into a new space if you wanted to. With custom panels, that tends to be a similar case where you could just, in the same manner, you can just take those panels with you. Now, with custom panels, if you're looking at custom dimensions, then perhaps it might be designed specifically for one room, and you might have these panels that kind of fit together and cover an entire wall. And that's based around the wall in your space. So if you move to a different space with different dimensions, then maybe it doesn't fit quite as nicely, and you don't have that same look that you might have had, and that same kind of coverage that you might have had. Now with custom panels, we're looking at kind of custom designs and have a lot more flexibility with the panels that we're able to design. So you might have things like tune treatment that's specific to the one room that you had the design for, and maybe that doesn't work so well if you moved it to a different room. Now, of course, with just kind of an off-the-shelf panel order, there's definitely companies making different kinds of tune treatments and things like that. So maybe maybe you do also order something there that is specific to the one room and won't work as well for another room. But it's more so generally in kind of the custom panel realm where you're going to really have treatment that's focused to be designed, kind of for that one room, and that room is what that panel was designed for. So if you take it to a different space, it may not work as effectively. It may not work at all, depending on how it's designed. So that's just another thing to consider if you're going with custom panels. And then with frame treatment, it tends to be a pretty permanent solution. You're not really likely to be able to just move that to a different space. You could technically take it all apart and reuse materials and things like that, but that's usually not practical. If you're taking a space and turning it into a studio through that framed approach, that space is most likely going to stay being a studio for a while. Hopefully, if you're able to stay in that studio for a while, and if you decide to move to a different space, that studio build out project is probably going to not go with you to a new space. That's quite a permanent solution. And related to that, kind of the intrusiveness or how much damage it does to the space with a panel order, it generally is not much damage, and it could be none. There's different ways you could have panels on stands, panels supported by their own structure. So you could potentially do no damage at all to the space. Same with custom panels. That's not really any different. Maybe you're kind of attaching the panels to the walls with some screws, things like that. Maybe just a couple holes to patch in the wall, and not really a big deal. With frame treatment, it tends to be a lot more invasive. At the bare minimum, you're going to be making a lot of holes in the walls. Maybe that's something you could patch up when you leave. Not such a big deal. Could definitely be possible. Would be more so kind of like a renovation project instead of just taking a couple things off the walls. If you're doing something a little more involved with potentially isolation, potentially building a new room from the ground up, then of course you are doing significant structural work. So there's not really any getting around damaging the existing space and being able to really leave the space as you found it without a significant amount of work to undo kind of everything you've done. So that is one thing to keep in mind if you were to want to go with a frame treatment approach versus a panel-based approach. As far as ease of execution goes, with a panel order, it tends to be very easy. You can go to the GIK website, and in 10 minutes, you could have your entire studio ordered, and in not too long, that could show up at your door. Of course, with the installation, you could put that up yourself in a couple of hours, probably. You could hire professionals to come in and put everything up for you. So really, it's quite easy. Within a couple of days, you could potentially have your studio go from an empty space to a finished studio space. With custom panels, it's a little more involved. There is some amount of coordination if you're ordering these custom panels from someone. It's generally not as straightforward as just having that simple shopping list that you go on and order. There's probably going to be some back and forth and discussion with different contractors or company building things out. If you are working with contractors on site to build those panels for you, then you are going to have some amount of construction going on in your space, and that's something to keep in mind. If you're doing it DIY, then of course it's not that easy to execute. You're probably looking at putting quite a few hours into building everything out for yourself. You're going to need the space to work and kind of get that all built. So it's not all that easy. I kind of put that in as medium because it can potentially be pretty straightforward. If you're ordering custom panels for someone, it might just be a little more communication required in the process. If you're doing DIY, it's probably going to be a little more involved. You're probably going to put in quite a bit of work, but it's still quite manageable. For a frame design, it's the ease is quite low. It's going to be a lot of work to get that space built out. It's really kind of a renovation for the space. You're probably dealing with contractors. If you're doing it yourself, then that's quite a bit of work to be doing yourself. It's a much more involved process, and it's probably going to be requiring a lot more time invested from your end. Even if you're working with a studio designer or studio build company that's able to just do everything for you, handle everything for you, there's still probably going to be a lot of checking in and communication and looking at the space and decisions to make throughout the build process. So you should prepare for quite a bit more involvement if you're going with a frame treatment approach. Now, a couple of other studio design considerations to touch on, which are things that could apply for really all these different cases. Really, any studio design project. These are things you might be considering and things worth looking at. So the design might be handled by one person or by a team of multiple professionals, and that's something to always keep in mind. Like we touched on before, always working with qualified professionals, making sure you have their input where necessary. If you don't have the answer to something, it's probably worth hiring a professional to help you out with that. Things like the general design of the space is often very important. If it's just a home studio, then that's usually not much of an issue. But if you're looking at building out a commercial facility or more of a home studio where you're having a lot of people come through, maybe you're working with bands or just other large teams that you're working with, you're gonna have to think things through, such as bathrooms, storage, parking, really things that aren't directly related to the studio itself, but are critical for the operations of the studio. Then there's also looking at isolation. In any studio build, whether it's panel based, frame treatment based, isolation is an option that you may or may not look at. You could do a frame treatment design and not look at isolation at all. You could do a simple panel based design, and isolation could be your main priority. So it really applies to any case, and that's one thing to look at. And typically for doing an isolation design and really improving the isolation of a space, you're going to be looking at a lot of measurements and analysis of kind of the existing space, the noise that you're generating, or the noise that's coming in from outside of the space that you're trying to minimize. Then you're going to be looking at walls, ceilings, floors, doors, windows, electrical, HVAC, really everything that goes into that space. It's probably going to have an effect on that isolation. So it's pretty involved design when you're looking at isolation if you really want to do things properly. I get a lot of people asking me, hey, I have this room next door to me and I don't want to bother the people. Can I just put these products on this wall? The answer is usually no. The answer is usually, we need to approach this a lot more in depth and really look at everything in your space, everything in their space. It's not really a simple fix like putting up panels in your room might be. It's generally a lot more involved, and also generally involves pretty significant construction work to be done to improve the isolation. Some other things to look at might be the electrical, the HVAC, things like both heating and cooling, which is of course very important, and also having fresh air, which tends to be the thing that most people ignore, especially with things like mini split systems. They might factor that into the design, but not have any considerations for fresh air. And that's, in most cases, that's a pretty big problem. So HVAC is usually something to look at in any studio design. Maybe if you have a space just in your house that you're turning into, a bedroom studio, that's not something you're really going to be looking at. It's not really within the scope and the realm of possibility. There's not really anything you can do about the HVAC. So maybe in that case, you're not really going to think about it. But aside from that, if you're really building out a space, if you're building a space where you want people to come in and work with you, then you probably really should be looking at the HVAC. There's things like custom furniture and of course your studio gear. As a studio designer, I often am recommending things like speakers. You'll often ask me, what speakers should I get? So sometimes working with a designer, there might be some gear recommendations, furniture recommendations. You might have some custom furniture being built for you. You might be working with someone else entirely to put together that kind of gear design, that kind of wiring, things like that. Then of course there's things like fire safety and accessibility, which tend to be more important for commercial projects and kind of a necessity. It's just something that you need to be looking at for things like building permits. For your home, generally not so much, but yeah, for kind of larger build outs and commercial spaces, that's something that's important not to overlook. And then lastly, also energy efficiency is another consideration that often gets brought up. Now, you're probably going to be looking at working with many different professionals depending on the scale of your project. Maybe if it's a simple panel-based approach, you can just do that essentially entirely on your own. You can if you have some basic acoustic knowledge, you can put together a plan and get that ordered, install it all yourself, and really no one else involved in the project. But as you get into larger projects, you do need to generally involve other professionals. So as far as the design goes, you might be having an architect that you're working with, of course, the acoustic designer themselves, especially if you're looking at isolation, then you're probably going to have a structural engineer involved to make sure everything is going to be safe, and as well as helping design certain aspects. Then a mechanical engineer looking at the HVAC and designing that HVAC system. Right now we're not really looking at the actual implementation of it, just kind of the design side of things. So perhaps your acoustic designer might help out with that HVAC design, or you might work with a separate professional. Then an electrical engineer or someone who's just advising on the electrical work, kind of coming up with a game plan for that. An energy advisor might be involved, especially if there's permitting. And then also an interior designer, really putting together the aesthetics of the final space. And then, of course, when it comes to the actual execution, if you're doing something like a custom panel-based approach that's built on site, or a frame treatment approach, then you're likely going to be working with many different professionals. You're generally going to be looking at working with some kind of general contractor or studio building contractor, who will be working with their own construction crew. If you're just ordering panels from someone, like a custom panel order, then you're probably going to be working with that company. They might have their own contractors that they send out to install everything for you, or perhaps you install it yourself. A lot of the times with frame treatment using fabric track systems, you will have a separate crew that installs the actual fabric track system, just because that's a bit more of a specialty skill, especially if you're in an area that has a lot of studios built. There'll be typically a professional that comes in just to do that. Your general contractor and their construction crew just doesn't have the experience to really pull that off in the same way that a dedicated team can do. Things like working with a finished carpenter, if you have some custom furniture, all the trim details, either around the treatment itself or around the rest of the room. If you really want to have that looking great, you might want to be working with a higher end carpenter who's able to really execute your vision for that. Then you're most likely going to be working with an electrician on a bigger project. Same, might be working with a plumber, especially if you have a bathroom, which you most likely would if it's kind of a ground up build. And then, of course, your HVAC contractor, that's very important. And then at the end of the project, you might be doing something like some speaker calibration. You might be having either the acoustic designer come by to inspect things. You might be hiring a different professional to come in and really dial things in for you. You might be working with other professionals, such as sales rep, that come in and really kind of just looks at the space and kind of helps you decipher things and get things up and running. And that's kind of the general team that you might be looking at working on your project, especially if it's kind of a higher end project and not so much a simpler panel based approach. Do we have any questions? I think that's the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Gerhard. Thanks a lot for presenting this so wonderfully. For everybody attending, this was very specifically, I don't know if you've seen the videos that we posted before the webinar, but we actually spent months designing this very simple webinar because we were very skeptical about how technical the webinar should be. And we ended up deciding that we do technical webinars all the time. And we end up having so many questions that can't be just answered within the scope of the webinar or the time limitations, or maybe let's say the audience joining in are sometimes of different backgrounds in terms of engineering and technical level of expertise. So that's why the webinar was limited to more of like a superficial overview of how a studio project is taken up, executed in multiple levels and in multiple domains of requirements. So, but the Q&A round is open to all sorts of discussions, technical, overviews, executional approaches, anything that you want to ask. So let's start with the beginning. There were a lot of good questions all around through the webinar, and we've kept for the end. The first one was from Jan. I'll highlight this for you. What makes a room inspiring for you when treating a space? Do you aim for transparency so it gets out of the way, or do you want it to add character to the sound? I've already answered this in the chat. I said ideally for a listening room, you wouldn't want a listening room to have a character to an acoustical, as an acoustical print to encourage transparent monitoring. But Gerhard, I'd like you to expand on it. What's your take on it? Do you think there should be
Yeah.
character in a room?
I think along the similar lines that I think the room should really be adding next to nothing. As far as your monitoring goes, if we're looking specifically at something like a control room, space for kind of critical listening. Now there are situations where that's really not the appropriate solution, especially with things like hi-fi, where people they have different expectations, and they want to be having their room contribute things. But when it comes to kind of a studio meant for music production, mixing, mastering, then my approach is to have it be as transparent as possible. For it to not be in a way, not have any noticeable effect on what you're hearing. Not kind of separate to that, but a related discussion would be the aesthetics and kind of the visual impression that the room has, because that many people don't know that that also has a pretty big impact on what you hear. Like you could put a nice painting in front of you, kind of on your front wall that you look at while you work, and that will change your listening experience because it changes your overall experience. Um, so there is some argument to be made for different aesthetic choices, having maybe things be busier, things be cleaner, maybe kind of just darker, so you don't see much going on, so that you're not really focusing on what you're looking at. Maybe having some visual elements that you're intentionally looking at. Like in my own space here, I chose a pretty busy fabric. That you can kind of see behind me here. But that's really on the back half of the room that I intentionally placed it so that when I'm working, when I'm facing this way, I don't see it at all. I just see simple plain fabric. So that was kind of an aesthetic decision, which does tie into my listening experience. So I think the visual aspect of things also is important, and is definitely a consideration. I generally leave the aesthetic aspects up to the client. I generally don't have much input on that, on kind of interior design and things like that. Of course, if someone wants my input, I'm happy to advise on that, but I generally focus more so on just the acoustic side of things. But I am aware that the visual side of things can also greatly affect their listening experience.
Yeah, that's one very great point Gerhard just took up, that what you hear is deeply influenced by what you see. And, this is something that people usually think that I'm joking around when I say it out. And to just give you a bit of an story to it, the particular one studio that Gerhard had put in his presentation that we recently designed, Studio Ananova. This is a very tiny room, and it's built to very tight standards actually, and it can be uncomfortable to some people, maybe, but most people it's not. The reason is of the psychoacoustic design, and apart from what goes into the acoustics, it actually is what you see. When the studio was almost built, but the fabric was not put on, the finishes were not put on, you could see rock wool everywhere. The client called me up, Harshit, from Chandigarh. He's a great mastering engineer, by the way. He called me up and he said, Vipul, the room sounds really very dead. I can't stand in the room for 10 minutes. And I'm like, just relax, let the fabric go on, let the door come in, let the acoustic door come in, and then tell me what you feel. When everything was in, he was like, dude, it just feels completely different now. I can stand in this room for hours and hours long. It's completely normal to me. And, it's not just about what makes you look comfortable. It's about how your visuals align with your hearing. There's this one effect known as McGurk effect, that what you hear and what you see together makes something very different. So it's kind of difficult to put into words. Maybe we'll have a whole discussion on it, but yeah, it actually is the real thing. It's not fad at all. You have to take care about the aesthetics, and you have to make sure that it aligns with what the sound of the room is. So it's kind of a different thing overall. But yeah, that's a very great thing, Gerard. That's nice to bring that up. We have another question from Jay Mathur. He asks, "What is your approach towards?" No, I think I've come down. No. Uh, I'll take this question later, Jay, but I'll just take up the earlier questions first. Yeah, there's this. There's a question from Sandeep: how to approach room measurements? What is the room speaker setup required? What is the flow for taking measurements? We can talk about a bit here.
Yeah, that varies quite a bit, at least from how I generally approach rooms design. I can't comment on any other studio designer's approach. But for me, in most of the cases that I work with, we're really doing the best we can. As much I generally work with much more limited projects. Not so much ground up builds where we can do whatever we want. It's more so just existing spaces that we're treating, and yeah, the goal is really just do as much as we can within reason, within a fairly limited budget, and live with the results. Essentially, we do the best we can. That means we can't really do better. Um, so in that case, the measurements aren't all that important from so much the acoustic design perspective. For things like membrane absorbers, I'll usually have people measure placing the microphone at different locations in the room. The speaker typically set up where the speakers will ultimately be, or kind of roughly in that location. So that does tie into the design process of the room and kind of how the treatment and my approach to the room gets put together. So that would be in the early stages, and I would send just some instruction for that. Later on, it's always good once the room is built or close to completion to take some measurements and have an idea of what's going on. If we're in these situations where we're just doing the best we can, inevitably you'll have certain different issues left, and it can be helpful to look at the measurements and just have an idea of what's going on, perhaps certain things to look out for, perhaps certain areas we could potentially add more treatment to try to improve on if that is a problem. Now, of course, with things like speaker calibration, then it's critical to have measurements. I wouldn't attempt to do that without really being able to have those measurements and have a very clear understanding of what's going on. So for me, at least it does vary quite a bit. Sometimes there's a lot of measurements going on. Sometimes there's not too many measurements going on. And even with a ground up build, the space obviously doesn't exist before it's built. So we can't go in and measure that space. So that relies a lot more on things like simulations and other data from other projects. And then once the room is kind of partially built, then we might start doing measurements for things like verifying the isolation. Then as treatment is being built, we might do some measurements for verifying things like membrane absorbers. So then measurements can be a lot more involved at various stages in the project. And then, of course, at the end, when we want to ultimately kind of just verify that everything is working as it should, and also if we're doing any kind of speaker calibration, then of course we need to really be able to see that and dial things in.
Yeah, hopefully this answers your question, Sandeep. And this question is taken to another level down by Ashwin, and he would like to know how to study REW graphs and know how to find problems or potential improvement opportunities. I think that this is a question that deserves a very long answer and a larger discussion. But if you think, Gerhard, there's a way to answer this in brief, that would be lovely.
Yeah, I think people generally focus too much on just the simple frequency response graph, because the thing that I try to that I kind of tell people over and over again is that really that's looking at a very long window in time. I believe it's typically 500 milliseconds. So it's essentially, it's not quite, don't quote me on this, it's not quite this simple, but it's essentially looking at that window in time, kind of everything that happens in that 500 millisecond window, and in a way averaging it all out into that line that you get. So, if you have a dip at a certain frequency, it doesn't really mean that the sound comes at you and it gets dipped down at that frequency and that's all that happens. It's a very complex interaction that's happening around the room, and when you average all that out, you end up with a dip. So a lot of the times, when you're treating a space, things might seemingly get worse, because you have something that might look flat, And as you start putting in some treatments that's effective at improving issues in that frequency range, and you start to kind of remove some energy that's going on, you start to essentially unmask problems that are there. So you might start creating a dip by adding in treatment, and then you might say, "Oh, well, I'm clearly making things worse, and this treatment that I've added is making things worse. I shouldn't. I'm doing the wrong thing here." But really, that dip was always there, but it was really covered up by other things going on. So that frequency response graph is quite misleading in that it doesn't really give you a good understanding of what's going on in the space. It's really just a very broad averaging out, and it can definitely correlate to your listening experience. If you have a dip somewhere, then you might struggle to kind of hear those frequencies. If you have a big peak somewhere, then of course you're probably going to hear that peak in the music that you're listening to. So I'm not saying it doesn't necessarily I'm not saying it's meaningless, but there's a lot more to it than just looking at that simple graph. So if you want to kind of go a step further, you want to jump to the spectrogram that shows the decay times, and especially in the low end, you want to be watching out for that. You kind of don't want those lower frequencies ringing out. And I find the spectrogram really easy to visualize that. Some people like looking at waterfalls, but I find there's just a lot going on in a waterfall. It can be a little tough to decipher just at a quick glance, really see what's going on. The spectrogram is kind of a bird's eye view of a waterfall, and it just kind of has less information going on, and it's easier to just pick out the issues. So that's where I'd recommend starting. If you're more worried about things like higher frequency reflections, then you can look at the impulse and kind of look for your little bumps there that might correlate to different reflections, and that could help you figure different things out. Beyond that, I don't think there's much that most people would benefit from. I don't know, Vipul, is there anything else that you would recommend looking at?
No, I think like I was just while you were answering this, I was just trying to find a brief way to sum it up what I would recommend. But to be honest, there's no brief way to put it out. One of the best advices that was exactly what Gerhard said. Frequency graphs can be very misleading. If I show you the frequency graph of this one room that's on the display, Studio Ananova, you'll probably think that this is a very amateur room. And when I show you the ETC graph of this room, you'll think that it's an anechoic room. But it's neither an amateur, neither an anechoic room. So the answer lies in the context. You have to look every graph, every single thing in context. Why the frequency response has so many dips. Then you have to take the windowed measurements of speakers. Then you'll find that those dips are already in the speaker. The room can only get as flat as the speaker is, right? So if the speaker has a lot of curves, the room will have naturally. So that also tells you that whenever you see a frequency response of anybody else's studio that looks like ruler flat, don't get overwhelmed by it. That is a result of a lot of things, including smoothing. When you see it when you see a frequency response at 1/48th of an octave resolution, it shows really wild curves. You'll be overwhelmed by it. But when you just smooth it out to 1/1 octave resolution, you'll see almost a ruler flat line even in the worst rooms. It's completely possible. So it's really important to look at context. And until the time that you can figure out context, learn how to read those graphs, try avoiding to go into the frequency response. Read spectrograms. They're much easier to read. They show a lot of data. And after that, the second part of your question that you said, how to identify the problems, the ETC is one of the best way. The energy time curve, the impulse response graph, is one of the best sources to identify problems. You'll see spikes occurring at different intervals of time that you can track down with the speed of sound and see what could be the problem surface, identify with the room modes, and find out. And that's a very good way to find out what the source of the problem is. And also, if you want to go into deeper into it, last year we did 3 webinars with John Brandt, Sam Burko, and Norman Varney, which all of them briefly covered a lot into how to measure a room, how to test particular products. You can watch the recorded videos on our YouTube channel, and you can learn quite a bit about it. We can also have separate webinar on this as well. Hopefully, this answers your question to some extent. And we have a question from Marco. Corner panels, we answered it during the webinar. Ashwin asked about the corners too. That was answered in webinar. There's a second part to Ashwin's question. If we can go later into determining the frequency of membrane traps, should they be designed for the mode of the direction they are facing or for mode perpendicular to the direction they are facing?
Like it, it could definitely apply to either. Um,
I don't think I understand the question. Like, what do you mean by the mode perpendicular to the direction they are facing?
I mean,
I
I
mean,
assume what
perpendicular
he's
to
asking
the
is, if you have, say, an axial mode traveling down the length of a room, do you want your membrane absorbers to be, kind of perpendicular sitting
floor to
on the
ceiling
back
mode.
wall, or do you want it to be kind of sitting parallel to that direction on the side
Okay,
wall?
okay, got it.
Um,
Makes
I mean, it can be effective either way. It's not really sensitive to that orientation so much. We're more so looking at kind of what's going on with the pressure. So typically, if we're kind of addressing that axial mode that's kind of going down the length of your room, then you're probably going to have your panels sitting on your back wall, kind of perpendicular to that direction. Kind of parallel to your back wall. That's at least how I typically address it. But there's nothing stopping you from putting it kind of on the side wall, kind of parallel to the direction of that mode. That wouldn't stop it from being effective.
Yeah, there's a million ways to do it, man. Like when you're putting a membrane on the ceiling, it's pretty difficult when you have to keep the membrane facing to the floor. The gravity effect just lowers on the membrane's effectivity by a lot. So you have to keep the membrane facing in the front. Then you have to make decisions around what mode you're targeting with it and all of that. But it's fine. There's no such rule around it. You have to figure your way around it. Then we have okay. Jay has asked a very wonderful question. Can you share some basic info on how someone would approach room geometry?
No. um, I don't know if there's really. I mean, kind of at the simplest form, if you want to approach room geometry, it's as simple as drawing out the shape you want. But as far as actually aiming towards some kind of target or achieving some kind of result, then that's much more complex. Um, and of course, different people will argue for different geometries. So there's not really a right or wrong answer. And if you look at kind of the acoustic literature out there, you're not really going to find much, especially not as it pertains to really being prescriptive and saying this is the right way to do it and this is the result that you're going to get, because that's ultimately really up to the designer and what their design philosophy is. Yeah, I'm not sure if how I could better answer that question. It becomes quite complex, depending to what lengths you're really trying to model what's going on and things like that. Now, of course, you can change the geometry without really, modeling anything kind of in that sense. You can, I'm not going to call it arbitrarily change the geometry, but, you can kind of change the geometry on some rules of thumb, to achieve certain goals. And perhaps you don't know exactly what's going to happen, exactly what the results is going to be, but, it could push you towards a certain result that is hopefully better than if you did a simpler geometry. And as far as designing that goes, it could be as simple as looking at other studios and how they're designed and kind of loosely copying that. If you want to do something more in depth and trying to predict what's going to happen, then that's a lot more difficult. With complex tools do exist that can help you model that and whatnot. There's argument as to how effective they are and kind of how the results that they give you translate into the real world. So yeah, it does get quite complex. I probably wouldn't attempt it without any kind of prior experience or knowledge of the subject. You might just cause more problems than you solve. Like I see a lot of people trying to change room geometry in an effort to get rid of room modes. Kind of the idea that if I get rid of my corners, then because the base builds up at the corners, if I have no corners, then I have no base build up. I've seen some arguments along those lines, and I would say, don't listen to that and don't go in that direction. It is a lot more complicated. And if you want to try some basic kind of changes of shape, you can kind of just go by eye and rule of thumb and kind of slightly change things. But if you're going to do something much more complex, then I wouldn't really want to just attempt that without knowing what you're doing.
I agree with you. That's a really sound advice, that don't just experiment unless you have the resources to, or you're okay with failures, or you know how what you're doing. Um, how to approach it? There are a thousand ways actually. So a public domain discussion is not really the right place to go much deeper into it. The discussions can get very long, and it depends designer to designer. One good thing I can recommend you is to read a paper by Dr. Peter D'Antonio, which he has published many years ago, about his design philosophy, that is reflection free zone, RFZ by RPG. I don't know if that's behind a paywall or not right now, but that's a good paper because RFZ was one of the first design philosophies that started uh, geometrically reshaping the rooms. So you can get a good idea about how this concept started, what you can do, what it is for. There are a million reasons to angle walls and a million reasons not to. So there's a lot of factors to count in. Hope this answers your question, Jay. There's a second part to Jay's question. Um, which is, can you share some basic info on how some, no, that was the first part. Also, what is your approach towards live room acoustics, considering a single small room which would be used for everything from recording instruments to vocals?
Yeah, I don't tend to design many live rooms, and that's just not something I have all that much experience with. I got into designing the acoustics work that I do with studios and kind of monitoring spaces, kind of control room spaces, out of the need for my own space. It really just came out of having the best space for myself, and then kind of helping other people and being able to offer that to other people. I'm not really I'm not a recording engineer, so I don't really focus on that side of the recording process. So the way that I typically approach live rooms in general, especially kind of a larger sized space, is really with a lot of flexibility from the client. A big part of it for me, at least, usually is a discussion of aesthetics. I think there's a lot of flexibility in terms of if you're doing things like redirecting high frequency reflections, kind of sort of scattering things. There's many different ways you can achieve that. So I tend to start out with a discussion of what they're after visually, different wooden structures, different materials, things like that. If they want more traditional diffusers, that's kind of the starting point for me. Now, if it's an existing space, an existing studio that they have that they want to improve on, then that makes things a lot easier because we kind of have a starting point where they can say, hey, I recorded drums in this space. Here's the drum recording. This is what I don't like about it. I want it to be livelier. I want it to be more dead. That makes the discussion a lot easier because, of course, a live room at the end of the day is very subjective. If you want something that sounds like a bathroom, then that's what you want. No one can say otherwise. And the correct solution for that is to have a space that sounds like a bathroom. So there's just kind of endless possibilities with live rooms. So there's a lot more discussion involved there. It's not like a control room where my idea is to get the speakers out of the way as much as possible. Sorry, the room out of the way from the speakers as much as possible, and kind of have that transparent experience. And I can kind of just work towards that goal as much as possible. But with a live room, we don't really have that single vision that we're after, and everyone's going to want something slightly different. So that's kind of the starting point that I go off of. And then for smaller sized spaces like a vocal booth, I have somewhat more of a kind of a uniform design I go with. A general approach I usually follow to creating a somewhat dry but still kind of open and neutral space. Not completely anechoic. I kind of reintroduce certain sort of reflections, but nothing too direct. Just kind of for the comfort of the person in there, and also focusing on not having a tiny space that kind of sounds like a closet with a lot of kind of lower frequency issues in the bottom of the vocal range that you often see in a lot of small vocal booths. So kind of for vocal booths, I think I offer a lot less flexibility unless you really wanted a space that's colored in a specific way. But then for larger spaces, larger live rooms, I do offer quite a bit more flexibility, and there's really not a standard design or philosophy that I'm after. I guess if you told me do whatever you want in the space, turn it into a live room, then I would come up with something that's kind of my own personal take on what I think a recording space should sound like. But that's not, that doesn't generally happen. And usually the client has a pretty specific idea of what they're after from that recording space.
Hopefully, this answers your question, Jay. And about the second part of your question, that you're considering a single small room for everything. I think for this, you should just hit up different designers. Every designer has a different method for doing those rooms, even though most professionals avoid these kind of projects because they're pretty tricky to do and require a reasonably good budget to do it. But yeah, every now and then I see many other companies coming up with really innovative designs for an single room. That's what I call like an AUOR room, all under one roof studio. So yeah, and I'm very fond of some of my particular designs as well. So just check out different designers, hit them up, ask what they're doing. There's no right or wrong answer in this particular question at all. Coming to next, Ajwad has asked, is using diffusion in a room more of a choice than a necessity? And I'd like to add Ashwin's question in conjunction to it. He's asking for strategies for adding diffusion once a build is completed or in an existing build. I would like Gerhard to answer this question, but just I'll give an opening line to it that figure out why you need diffusion for.
Yeah. As far as a monitoring space goes, if we're looking at that specifically, then I typically don't use much in the form of kind of a traditional diffuser. As far as kind of wanting the most transparent listening experience with the room, not contributing anything to the listener speaker interaction. In that sense, I don't want to introduce anything, and I would never purposely put that in. Now, as far as the kind of psychoacoustic side of things and your own comfort in the space, then it is important to have something be able to give you that information, especially when you get into a project where you have more complete coverage in the room, like with the frame design. If it's just a couple of panels in the room, then I don't think that's really an issue. You're not going to have it's not going to feel anechoic. But looking at these kind of higher end projects where you have significant coverage, then I do think it's important to have certain elements introduced around the room that will give you that kind of self acoustic side of things. Potentially that could be a diffuser. Some people might use diffusers. I typically don't. So that would be looking at specifically from kind of a control room monitoring perspective. From a live room, then of course, it's really up to you. As far as determining whether you should add a diffuser or not, that's kind of up to you if you have an existing space and you want to add something into. I've worked with some people where they built out the design that was kind of essentially anechoic as far as the listener speaker interaction goes, and that turned out to just not really be what they were after. They introduced some kind of reflections at kind of the early reflection points. They introduced some, they put up some pieces of wood there to intentionally introduce some reflections, and that gave them what they wanted. That was a monitoring experience that they wanted. So perhaps if you want something different that maybe doesn't align with my own design philosophies, perhaps what you're after is having some diffusers somewhere around the room. But ultimately, that's kind of your call. I can't really say what's right or wrong for for what you want out of your listening experience.
Yeah, I think it makes total sense. Hopefully that answers your questions. And then we have another question by Ajwat again. How effective is time domain correction using tools like DRC, FIR, accurate audio lens, focus fidelity, of course, after proper acoustic treatment? Please comment on primitive tools like ARC or SonarWorks and if they're useful at all. Well, this is a can of worms. I'll let you answer it, Gerhard.
Yeah, I would say this is something I have quite a bit of experience with, both from my speaker design work and from just my work on calibrating speaker systems, whether it's for myself or for other people. So as far as kind of what you might call time domain correction, there's really kind of two sides to that. As far as time domain issues in the room go, then it's impossible to fix that with any kind of DSP. You can't cancel out what's essentially an echo or a reflection. There's no kind of processing you can do that will eliminate that from the room. So that's not something I would ever recommend attempting to do. I would always focus on the speaker itself. And of course, you can EQ sort of low end kind of room EQ type thing. I don't see anything wrong with that to an extent, but that's really not going to fix the time domain side of things. That's really just a kind of a simpler EQ to smooth things out. Now, looking at the time domain of speakers, that is something you can correct, and that relates to the phase response of the speaker. So basically, in most speakers, unless they have phase correction built into them, the crossovers, what kind of separates what the signal that should go to your tweeter, the signal that should go to your woofer, that introduces a phase shift. That's just by the nature of filters, of crossover filters. And that phase shift translates to delaying certain frequencies more so than others. So, your speaker is going to play one frequency, and then at a later point in time, it'll play another frequency, even if you kind of send those frequencies to the speaker at the same time. So with phase correction, or kind of time domain correction, you can make the speaker, you can delay certain frequencies in relation to other speakers, and basically make the speaker play the frequencies at the same time. So that would be the time correction or phase correction in a speaker. And that's typically what you look at with systems like Trainov or Dirac, Dex, Accurate. So they offer that added timing correction or phase correction, which generally requires the use of FIR filters to kind of time align the frequencies that your speakers play that. At the same time, systems like Trainov will typically also kind of try to correct other things going in the room, other reflections, simply because it has to rely on kind of an automated algorithm that spits out an answer for everyone. You can't really look at your individual case and determine what it should and shouldn't do and correct only the speaker. It's basically going to be trying to correct other things going on in the room. And that's why I don't personally recommend systems like Trainov, even though the kind of the correction and kind of DSP that I set up in studios is along the same lines. It's kind of the same principles of that FIR correction and other EQ tools. I find that the results are different because I look specifically at the speakers first and only correct. The only kind of phase timing correction that I do is on the speakers themselves. And then separate to that, I might do things like some room EQ in the low end, some preference EQ if you want more low end, top end. But I'm really not applying those more complex tools for the time correction on the room effects themselves. Now with tools like SonarWorks, that's really just kind of a more simple EQ that doesn't do the FIR processing and kind of that time phase correction. So you do lose that aspect of the being able to correct the phase response of the speakers. Now there can be some benefit to kind of room EQ and improving certain things, but in my opinion, those systems tend to do far too much. Like you get quite a squiggly graph throughout the entire range, and might try to do quite a bit of boosting and cutting, and I find that's usually not going to lead to a great listening experience. So as far as how I usually approach kind of EQ specifically for the effects of the room, it would be much simpler than what tools like SonarWorks do. So, it might be 3 or 4 kind of broad bands of EQ, really not kind of that squiggly line that those systems tend to do. Yeah, I think that.
I think we can wrap it up by saying that this is not in particular about any brands or something. I mean, they're all brands doing a good job at what they do, but it's just about the technology and the context they are being used in. Like if you're trying to compensate for time problems in your room with something like a digital correction that's just doing everything on the level of speakers, there's no logical way to be able to fix those problems, and you generally tend to do more harm than good. And yeah, I think that's the extent of it through what we can answer on it. There's a lot of problems associated with this, and to experience those problems, you need to be able to sit someone who knows the system inside out in a good room to experience and AB with and without the compensating compensation systems. We have Jan asking, what's your take on speaker stands? Do you subscribe to the idea that more mass equals better? Gerhard, while you answer this question, I'll have to take a quick break. I'll have a call to answer, postpone a few sessions. I'll be back, please.
Okay. Yeah, that's a bit of a somewhat loaded question. So generally, yes, I do recommend using kind of heavier stands. I often recommend just using a stack of cinder blocks, just kind of concrete blocks to make it as heavy as possible. There is the argument for decoupling, and that's definitely important if your result is kind of the ultimate listening experience. A big part of that is because the sound from your speakers will transmit through the stand and kind of into the floor, into the rest of the structure, and it can actually reach you, the listener, faster than it can reach you through the air. So that structure-borne sound traveling through your floor and then kind of up through your chair, up through your legs, into your ears, can actually arrive to you before you actually hear the sound through the air from the speakers. So, as you can probably imagine, that can negatively affect your listening experience. So ideally, you don't want to have those kind of vibrations traveling any other way than through the air. At the same time, it can also kind of excite different things in the room. If your walls is vibrating and you have a speaker that's attached, and kind of that wall is resonating and kind of creating its own sound, that can be problematic. Now, the problem with speaker decoupling is kind of twofold. One is you need to have an appropriate resonance frequency. So any kind of decoupling system works like a spring, and it isolates some frequencies, meaning that energy doesn't get transmitted through that isolation system. And then certain frequencies transmit very easily through that system, at the resonant frequency. It's kind of a bouncy spring, and it allows all the energy through, and provides, effectively no isolation at that frequency. So generally with isolating speakers, decoupling speakers, you want that resonant frequency to be below the range, that the bandwidth that the speaker has. So generally you want to be at least an octave below the lowest frequency that the speaker plays, so that the speaker is never actually exciting the system at that frequency, so that the system is always isolating the entire range that the speaker can play in. Now, one of the big problems with that is, in order to get that resonance frequency low enough, you end up with a spring system that's very wobbly, and if you can imagine, just kind of a very wobbly spring that's able to wiggle back and forth, kind of like Jello. Um, that can be very effective at decoupling those frequencies and stopping them from transmitting through from the speaker into the stand, to the wall, whatever it might be. But then the problem becomes that the speaker is essentially very wobbly. It's kind of sitting on Jello, and any small movement, whether it's from the speaker, kind of the drivers on the speaker, kind of pushing against the air and making the speaker cabinet move around, or whether it's kind of vibrations coming from somewhere else, they can kind of make the entire speaker move around in space, and that will negatively affect your listening experience. So on one hand, it's beneficial to have that speaker decoupling and that isolation, but on the other hand, in order to do it properly, it's not as simple as just putting some kind of simple isolation device that either will have the resonant frequency in the passband of the speakers. So you could run into issues with when that speaker plays that certain frequency that gets transmitted to the system, or you can end up with a system that's very wobbly and that introduces its own problems. So in most cases, I recommend just using something like a stack of concrete blocks, maybe add something very thin, like a very thin rubber, just so you make sure you're not kind of scratching your speaker, scratching your floor, just kind of protect things, but have that system be as rigid as possible. Because in order to actually decouple properly and not introduce those problems, it is quite a complex task. And some products do better than others. Some products on the market do introduce certain products, certain problems. So it is tricky. And unless you're ready to pay quite a bit for a well-engineered speaker stand, then your best bet is to just kind of go with the most massive and rigid thing that you can that's just not going to allow your speaker to move at all.
Yeah, that's a very good explanation, and I 100% agree with you. Speaker decoupling is really a very hot topic among enthusiasts to designers, and a lot of resources on the internet appear like as the gospel for speaker decoupling. And I really hate to be this guy, but I always encourage DIY designing, DIY experimentation. But speaker decoupling is one of the very few topics, and in fact, the only topic that I can remember that I always strongly advise to not do, not even attempt doing it if you don't know what you're doing. I've been to a lot of professionally designed studios, and I really feel bad to say that the same problem that Gerhard mentioned, that speakers decouple on springs. It's easy to decouple a speaker. You can just design a spring, put them upon, you see no vibrations transmitting. But the wobbly speaker produces so many problems to a lot of extent. And it's not just about the response, because the response is distorted because of the speaker moving back and forth. Also, it affects the excursion of drivers. So it is really possible to damage your drivers permanently if you're just putting it on a wobbly system. So this is something that you should avoid doing if you really want to reduce the transmission of vibrations. As Gerhard said, make the stand as rigid as possible. Make sure it's not resonant. Additionally, what I recommend is use some basic dampers. You won't believe the amount of difference by using simple moon gels or even that blue tack tape can do. You can just put them under your speakers. They can still damp the transmitting vibration to quite an extent. But don't use anything like springs or pads at all if you don't know what you're doing. And avoid using stuff like those foam pads or the ISO stands they put on desk. They do next to nothing. If the ISO stands don't do any harm at all, they just elevate your speakers, so you sometimes feel that the speaker sound is improved. But the foam pads are doing really harmful effects to your speaker. Same thing as a wobbly spring. So don't use any of that. There's another question by Ajwat. Are there any set standards for a mastering room? Is it absolutely necessary to be able to hear from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz? Also, guys, if you have any more questions, it's the right time to ask for it. We'll take a few more questions before ending this session, and I'll just scroll if I've missed anything in between. Gerhard, please answer this if you can.
I would say not really. I mean, a designer might have their standards that they try to design their studios to, or that they might guarantee that their studios are designed to. But outside of that, there's not really any kind of accepted standard, and different designers, there are many different high-end studio designers around the world that are doing completely different things and different approaches, and the results are also completely different. So, there's really no standard way or standard metric or goal that you might have for a mastering studio. And there are many of the top mastering engineers in the world, work in rooms with surprisingly little treatments. So as far as that goes, I would say not really. There isn't really any kind of standard unless you're looking at a specific designer and kind of what their own personal standard. As far as kind of bandwidth, yes, I would say it's important to have a kind of a full range system and have an accurate listening experience in that full range, whatever you kind of deem to be acceptable and accurate. Some people do work with with less than that, with kind of less of a full range system, and that works for them, and they get the results that they need. Um, but I think for most people, they would benefit from being able to hear everything. Perhaps you could rely on headphones and different solutions and be able to get all the information that you need without having that full range system. But at least for me personal and kind of for me personally and for the kind of the recommendations that I would make to anyone wanting to approach this, I would say to try to get that full range experience.
Yeah, that pretty much answers the question, I think. I hope it answers for you, Ajwat. Heading next, Ashwin has asked, do you aim for more of a house curve or a flat curve when designing rooms and then use EQ for the house curve? Uh,
I would I would not, my goal is never a flat curve on the frequency response. And there's a lot of kind of literature talking about that and why that generally doesn't work. Just aim for that flat curve. Of course, there is some debate and there is a lot of personal preference. My my kind of standards curve that I go for and what I personally prefer is something that starts kind of higher at the bottom end and slowly goes down as you get towards the top end, kind of a tilted response. But that definitely doesn't work for everyone. Some people want the top end to go kind of up, to shoot back up and have a very bright sound. Some people want the bottom end to be very boosted. That's definitely a very personal thing. So when I'm calibrating studios for someone or speaker systems, even if it's not a studio that I've personally designed for someone, there is always kind of a preference EQ, and in order to do that, I'll set things up before that. We know kind of the rest of the calibration process without the preference EQ, and then they'll get a chance to listen and give me some feedback, and then we can go from there and just kind of adjust things, dial things in. I usually recommend living with the system for about a week or so, just try to get used to it, and then we can revisit it and adjust things. I do usually recommend staying within certain limits, nothing too extreme, especially if it's more so for kind of a mixing or a mastering setup. Maybe if you're doing something like producing, or if it's more just kind of a hi-fi listening space, then you might want something that's a little more extreme and a lot of boosted top end or a lot of boosted bottom end. But for the most part, I do try to stay within a fairly small window, but that still allows you to kind of have more low end, less low end, more top end, less top end. So there isn't really, I don't think there's any right or wrong answer. It's definitely subjective. Um, but yeah, kind of my starting point and what I use for myself is kind of a tilted response with a little more in the bottom end and a little less at the top end.
but Gerhard, would you say that this is a result of more like the speaker response, not the design of the room? Or is it the other way
Uh,
around?
yeah, like that wouldn't be a consideration when it comes to designing the acoustics of the
Yeah.
room itself. That's more so either a speaker decision or EQ on that speaker. Ultimately the speaker itself is EQ'd. That it could just be kind of a mechanical system that's effectively EQ'd. You can still boost the top end of a speaker through sort of mechanical means, or that speaker might have EQ built in. Whatever it might be. The speaker response and EQing that speaker response is essentially the same thing as far as kind of preference EQ goes. Whether you want more top end, less top end. So you could buy a different speaker. You could EQ the speaker you have. But yeah, as far as designing the room itself goes, that's not really a consideration for me.
Yeah, actually, that's why I asked this. And Ashwin, I'd like to stress on this a lot that, we discussed this, in fact, when we were discussing about how to read measurements, how to conduct measurements, that you should never really aim for frequency response. When you aim for a curve while designing rooms, while designing the acoustics of rooms, it can be very misleading. Anyone can achieve a flat curve, a tilted curve, or anything like that. Or you can have a great room and have a really weird looking curve at all. The more important part is the time response throughout the spectrum. Look at impulse response, filtered impulse response graphs. They offer a lot of insights and they're really hard to get them right. If you get your filtered impulse responses right through all the bands within a very consistent decay time through, let's say, minus 60 dB and minus 80 dB, you can rest assured your room is great, even though if the frequency response looks ugly. So please don't avoid using that. And as far as preferred curve goes, that, as Gerhard said, it's very subjective.
Well, I think to add on to that, it's probably important to mention that it's somewhat of a different matter when you're looking at hi-fi and how those rooms are set up, and a lot of the kind of the literature and research that has been done relating to kind of target curves and things like that are more so for that hi-fi market
Yeah.
and spaces that have a lot less treatment. And a big thing with that is that your speaker directivity is going to matter a lot more. Kind of how your speaker projects sound in different directions. When you have a lot of those reflections coming back at you, the way that they sum is going to be different. Kind of depending on the room, depending on what you have in the room. So one speaker might behave one way, a different speaker might behave in a very different way, depending on how it kind of projects that sound into the
Hmm.
room. And so, in a
Yep.
sense, a room kind of designed with that in mind, a lot more reflective surfaces, kind of intentionally introducing things like that. It'll kind of have a curve of its own and its own way of affecting the speaker and the response that you get out of different speakers in that room. So, in a sense, you can kind of design a kind of a rough curve that most speakers will deliver based on how you treat those reflections and things like that in the room. But when we look at more so kind of professional listening spaces for mixing mastering, the goal, at least kind of from my design philosophy, is to get rid of that as much as possible. And at that point, the speaker's directivity ends up mattering a lot less because the energy that it sends off in different directions isn't going to come back at you. So that's where I wouldn't really care about what kind of the ultimate curve ends up being. It's kind of just essentially an anechoic and essentially based on the speaker, or if you're EQing that speaker.
Yeah, 100%. Jan is asking, Gerhard, just out of curiosity, what's the current state of your room? Love the design. Do you have any more upgrades or changes planned?
Thanks. I'm quite happy with it. This room was designed somewhat as a. It wasn't designed to be the best possible studio. It was largely designed to be somewhat in line with most of the projects that I work on with other people. Kind of the goal being do the most that we can, do the best that we can within certain limits, within certain reason. I built everything myself in this room, all the treatments, all the drywall, everything I did myself. And a lot of people that I work with do something similar of are either doing most of the work themselves or maybe working with one or two other people. So I wanted to build something that was somewhat similar to that and trying to push that as far as possible. I wasn't building a bunker with treatment everywhere. There's plenty of spots in my room where there isn't treatment, like where there's kind of some bare walls showing. And if you asked me to design the best possible studio, there basically wouldn't be any bare walls showing. Might have some windows in certain spots and things like that, but the goal is really usually a lot of treatment around most of the room. So this studio is kind of a midway point between getting the best results we can within reason. Not quite the level that you might get from kind of a higher end, more complex build, but at the end of the day, I'm very happy with the results. I have no desire to improve on the acoustics here. I don't really have any reason to, as far as things like measurements and whatnot go, kind of higher frequency reflections, it's really nothing coming back at me. It's effectively anechoic. One of the big things is I only care about my own listening experience at my listening position. So, I don't care about if there's reflections back at the couch. I really have zero interest in what's going on back there. It's really just designed for this one position. If you wanted a space where you could go anywhere and not have any reflections, then that's kind of a different story and would be designed differently. So that's just kind of how I approached it. There's definitely, there's kind of a small issues relating kind of from the ceiling not being entirely covered with treatment and whatnot. But as far as kind of the subjective experience, nothing really bothers me. And I've been in higher end rooms that had everything possibly done, and it really wasn't anything that I would trade this room for. And a large part of it is also kind of the custom speakers, which are kind of designed around the room itself and essentially kind of built into the room itself. So I also wouldn't trade any other room for this because I obviously then wouldn't have the custom speakers. So that's also a big part of it for me.
Yeah, indeed, the space is really looking great, and I'm sure it sounds even better. Moving ahead, we have Ashwin asking, what are your opinions on the 1D slats, BAT, or any pattern?
I'd say I don't really have any opinion on them. Like, I mean, for kind of going back to things like live rooms, there's really no right or wrong. In terms of kind of reintroducing some reflections in monitoring spaces for the psychoacoustic side of things, I think there's also a lot of flexibility, at least in how I usually incorporate those elements. So it could be something like that, especially if it's more so from an aesthetic perspective. If you want to have something that's visually interesting in the space, then I wouldn't say no to that and using devices like that for that application. But in general, as far as interacting with speakers intentionally, I would that's not something that I would ever be going for. For live rooms, sure, there's no right or wrong. So yeah, I don't know if there's really anything more I can add to that. It's not like I really have much of an opinion on them.
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing to have an opinion on. You should just check out the designers or say creators web. The bad as far the BED, as far as I remember, was invented again by RPG. Look up their website for what it has to offer. The slats are just a very conventional way of using surfaces. So if you want to know a bit on it, I think Gerhard, you would also agree. Like a lot of places, sorry, a lot of control rooms where the speakers are not flush mounted, slats can be a very simple way to range limit the absorption of front wall and introduce the feedback as well. So that's
Yeah.
one way to use it. There's a lot of ways to use it depending on how you space the slats, how thick slats you use, how deeper slats you use. So it's more related to geometrical use of them. There's nothing to have an opinion on. I hope this answers your question. Then Donnie is asking, any other literature you recommend? I think I found the paper. Okay. Um, I think if you ask, there's a lot of literature to read upon in acoustics. I have a full library with me. If you ask specific questions, I think we can recommend something. Is there anything general you would like to recommend, Gerhard, in literature?
Not really. I mean, I think as far as from looking at it from a theoretical standpoint, there are endless acoustics textbooks. I've probably read a couple dozen acoustics textbooks that really look at the physics and things like that. But at the end of the day, that doesn't really help you designing a studio all that
Yeah.
much. It doesn't really give you that practical information, and it also doesn't give you kind of the goals that you should aim for. Kind of the broader studio design philosophy. So that's where I think there isn't really much that I recommend. People often recommend the Master Handbook of Acoustics, and I think that's kind of a good starting out point for learning about the basics, different kinds of treatment, things like that. As far as kind of the actual design examples in there, that's not really something I would pay much attention to. And that's really where I don't think anything is going to help you. There's not really any books or textbooks that say this is how you design a studio, this is how everything works, this is how you treat these things effectively, especially when we're looking at things like the low end. That information just isn't really out there. And I would also say, just kind of for the most part, no one really has that information either. There's still quite a few unknowns. I don't think a lot of people really have a complete understanding and answer to everything, and we would be able to really put it all together in a way that they could just teach you and kind of hand you that solution.
Yeah, that makes sense. The conventional books popularized as the acoustics handbooks, studio design guides, beat by there are a lot of reputable people publishing these books, and they're all good, no doubt about it. But don't mistake them as a guide that you could just give you the blueprint of designing your studio. They're not meant to do so. They're just documentations of life's works on a superficial level of many different people. If you want to really dig into the physics of it, they're university books. They are really good at telling you what to do. Like how to design a system. And again, even they don't tell you how to design a system, but they give you the necessary means to. You'll have the calculations, how to calculate a system, how to account for the errors and all. But then you're like really diving into real physics. So I'm not sure if you're interested in any of those. That's why I asked if you have any specific to ask for, I can recommend. And if you need to know what to avoid, there are some books that you should really avoid, which I really can't say out loud. But you can DM me and I can tell you which books to not read at all. There are some books on that. Then Ajwal is asking, if I'm in a small room, is it better to use a bigger speaker or should I stick to smaller monitors and then add a pair of subs for sake of flexibility in positioning? Good question.
Yeah, definitely a good question. So on one hand, there's really no such thing as having kind of too big of a speaker for a space. And some people say, "Oh, I have this size space, so I need to have an 8-inch woofer, and if I have this bigger space, then I can have a 12-inch woofer." That's really not a thing. There's really no such thing as a speaker being too big. Now, what is a factor to consider is the kind of the listening distance to the speaker, because different speakers will have kind of a minimum distance that they will really work properly at. You can't really be, if you imagine kind of the big giant PMC BB6 towers, if you're standing half a meter away from them, it's really just, it's not going to work. You really need to have some distance in order to have kind of that cohesive sound from all the drivers on the speakers. So kind of the bigger factor really is just kind of that listening distance that you're able to have in your room, and then having a speaker that works for that. So yes, in a lot of cases, if you have a very small room, then putting a bigger speaker won't work. And it's not because the drivers are too big, and it's not because the drivers are putting out too much energy or too much low end or anything like that. It's because you're just too close to them. So maybe a better solution is probably going to be to have a smaller speaker. Usually I call that satellites, and then a sub. Because in that case it can usually be designed in such a way where you can be quite close to the satellite speakers without having issues. And in the sub speaker, which is kind of taking over the low end, it doesn't really introduce many issues from that distance. You can be a lot closer to that system without having those issues introduced. And you want to be able to be as close to a lot of larger system, even if they have kind of similar drivers and a similar sub. It's just not going to integrate as well. But if you kind of have that separate sub and it's crossed over at a low frequency, then that's really not going to be an issue. So you can be very close, and still kind of get that benefit from having the sub. And in that case, you could have a pretty giant sub. Maybe a 21-inch sub isn't realistically going to fit in your space. But I would recommend, I always recommend at least a 12-inch sub. Kind of the bigger the better. If you can get a 15-inch sub and that works in your space, you can kind of physically fit it into the space nicely, then I would say go for that. It's really not, there's no such thing as it being too much. And I don't want to get really into speaker design here, but generally you want to have the least amount of movement from the drivers that'll lead to the lowest amount of distortion. And kind of bigger drivers will give you the same SPL for with less movement. So if you imagine an 8-inch woofer trying to put a lot of low end out versus a big 15-inch woofer putting that same volume out, the 15-inch woofer has to move a lot less, so it's able to move a lot more linearly. When it's just moving a fraction of a millimeter versus moving 2 centimeters back and forth, it can do that much more controlled, and have lower distortion. So in general, you want to have the drivers move as little as possible, which requires bigger speakers, kind of for the same volume. So generally you want to have big speakers as possible. Of course, the quality matters and whatnot. But yeah, so I usually recommend at least a 12-inch sub. If you can go for something like a 15-inch, even better. Assuming it's still a high quality unit.
Yep. Hopefully, this answers your question, Ajwad. And Ashwin has asking, what would be an appropriate RT time for a room? I know it depends on the size, but is there an approximate you aim for? You answered your question, Ashwin. But yep, Gerard.
Um, Not really. Like yeah, it definitely just kind of depends on the room, kind of the room volume, things like that, and the results that you're kind of going for, your kind of your expectations, and how much treatment you're, what lengths you're really looking to go through, and how much treatment you're willing to put into that room to get to that goal. Um, so yeah, I don't think there's much benefit into giving concrete numbers, especially when it's going to vary quite a bit by room size. You know, kind of my studio here is very large, and if you compare the decay times in here to a small room, it might seem very large. But when you actually look at the math and kind of look at what's acceptable for a room this size, then you know it's extremely well controlled. Even if it's, you know, kind of longer decay times than in a very small room, it's just kind of very much a case by case basis. Um, yeah, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. You know, it's kind of just up to the designer and their philosophy and their targets they're trying to achieve.
Exactly. And also, I'd like to add, Ashwin, that reverb time would be a misleading term for what you're referring to. Because in smaller rooms, reverb time doesn't exist because a diffuse field doesn't exist. And what you see on the REW graph as a RT60, RT30, they're not exactly recorded values. They're computed by the other recorded values. So if you actually take a lot of measurements at the same position of speakers and mic in the same room, you'll notice that the reverb time measure graph always varies by quite a bit. There will be a variation in there, which is unjustifiable. That basically tells you that the reverb time is measurement is invalid for a room. It's better to look at the ETC graph, the impulse response graph, and look at the decay times that you can look at minus 60 dB, minus 80 dB to account for what kind of decay character your room has. But the reverb field is basically non-existent in our rooms. I think we have answered all the questions. Right. I hope I haven't missed anyone's question. If any, please, it's now the time to put it out. But I really thank you all for joining in. We've had almost 30, 40 participants throughout the session, although a lot of them have leave the webinars by now. I appreciate you guys sticking to the end, and I hope you're going to take some good value out of it. Thank you so much, Gerhard, for giving the time. I really appreciate you preparing this webinar, spending the time with me, and coming for this as well.
It's my pleasure.
All right. See you guys. Hopefully, see you in another webinar. If you have any other guests to recommend you'd like to see on a webinar, please let us know. It's 2 a.m. That's great that you're joining at 2 a.m. I hope this was worth your time. Thank you, guys. See you around. Have a good day. Bye bye.
All right.